Hello Blitz Kid students, how you doing today? This is Coach Russell, and today I am going to be doing a video on the game of the week. Here in this game, I was black, and I went on to play the French defense against my opponent. Now, those of you that don't know what the French defense is, you're about to find out. So, white played e4, I played e6. Most players play pawn to d4. Other possibilities, of course, are possible. I played pawn to d5. My opponent then played e5. So here we went on to play what's called the advanced variation. If your opponent does capture and I capture, can anybody take a guess of what variation that would be? And if you said exchange variation, you are correct. So this would be the exchange variation. We went on to play the advanced variation. Now, as you can see, this pawn formation that I have is really typical of the French. And one of the greatest strengths of the French defense is the pawn structure. The pawn chain that I have here on f7, e6, and d5. It's very difficult for white to try and break down. The only bad part is the mobility. As you can tell, my knight on f6 is unable to go. My knight on g8 is unable to go to f6 because the pawn on e5, and this bishop on c8 is trapped in by the e6 pawn. Now the good thing is that I have two pawn breaks in this position, and here I played one of the pawn breaks, which is pawn to c5, basically hoping that pawn captures and I'm able to place my bishop on a good diagonal or a better square. And the other pawn chain that I have, instead of playing c5, is pawn to f6. So if pawn takes, knight captures immediately on f6. But I went on to play c5. Now my opponent played c3, and by playing pawn to c3, as you can see, is defending the pawn on d4. So if I capture, they capture, and they maintain a strong pawn chain. So I played knight to c6, and by playing knight c6, as you can tell, I'm increasing the pressure both on e5 and d4. And my opponent played knight f3 to, of course, defend those two squares. Now here I played bishop to d7. Now I know that the bishop's not going very far, but what I am going to do is maybe perhaps bring my rook to c8. So you see other advantages of playing c5 when I do exchange on d4 is I'll open up the c file and possibly use it later on in the game. Which in this game I was exactly what I did. I was able to use it later on in the game. My opponent then played bishop to d3. Basically stopping my ideas of maybe bringing my knight to e7 and f5, or maybe g6, depending, of course, on what white plays. So I decided to exchange, and now maybe going for that idea. Maybe not yet, because I'm pretty sure that he will then capture, because I'll be putting a lot of pressure on d4. Opponent plays knight c3. I now play rook to c8. I think I should have maybe played a6 first, stopping the knight from coming to b5 and then eventually coming to d6. but my opponent castled right away, which gave me time to play a6 and stopping that threat. Now my opponent played bishop to e3, and I was trying to find a way to castle, and I can't get this bishop out, so that's why I decided to play pawn to g6 with the idea of playing bishop to g7 and then castling. Here my opponent then played bishop to g5. As you can tell, by playing bishop to g5, he pins my knight to my queen. So if my knight decides to move, bishop can easily just capture my queen. So this is called a relative pin. And remember, there's two types of pins, relative and absolute. An absolute is when they pin your piece to the king, which you'll see later on in the game. I continued with my plan, and I played bishop to g7. Now white played rook to c1, and basically he's getting the same idea of putting the rook on an open file, because remember, rooks belong on open files or half open files. In this case, because there's no pawn on the c file, it would be a open file. If there's one pawn of either color, it would be a half open, and as you can tell, we have pawns of both colors, so that would be a closed file. I castled to get my king to safety. Opponent played rook to e1. And now here I played h6, and basically what I'm trying to do is get this bishop out of this diagonal. But of course my opponent doesn't really have to cooperate, and he can always play back to h4, which is exactly what my opponent played. He played bishop to h4, and now he keeps the pin. So that's why I played pawn to g5, hoping that maybe the bishop would go back to g3. Here my opponent played a very interesting move and played knight captures g5, pawn captures g5, and then bishop captures g5. Now basically he traded a knight for two pawns. And then here I decided to play my second pawn break, but as you can tell, the reason I play this pawn break is because of all the possibilities of attack that white has against me. I mean, it's really strong. So this is why I played this pawn break now. But I played it by playing f5 because, as you can see, it kind of forces him to play a move that's called en passant. Because now if he doesn't capture this pawn, this bishop does not have this diagonal. So this is why my opponent en passant. Now en passant is only played when a pawn is in its starting position and pushes up twice. If my pawn would have been on f6 and pushed up once, you're not able to en passant. This is the only time that the white's piece captures in a different way. So if pawn pushes twice, they have to be next to each other. A lot of students get confused in the very beginning, and when they play pawn to e4 and your opponent plays pawn to e5, they want to play e captures d5 or f5, thinking that that would be en passant. But don't get it confused. Remember, it has to be next to each other, and white is only able to do it on the 5th rank, and black is able to do it on the 4th rank. Alright, so here my opponent en passant. Now, if I was to play bishop captures f6, which was I was about to, I then saw queen to h5. Very dangerous attack. So I had to sacrifice my rook. Here, now white played queen to g4 check. I could simply run away, or I can block like I moved, or what I played. I played bishop to g7 to defend. Plus, it keeps it closer to my king. Over here, nothing was protecting it, and on g7, my king has a good hold of him right now. And as you can tell, this bishop is in a different square color, so this bishop would never be able to attack my bishop. Opponent played queen to h5. Not really seeing a big threat with queen to h7. I don't see any threats there. So I decided to just capture this hanging pawn with my knight and maybe eventually bringing it into the game. My opponent then played queen to h7, so I simply moved my king to the side. Now he played rook to e3. Now by playing rook to e3, as you can see, he's created a rook lift. This is called a rook lift, but he also left this piece undefended. So I also see a possibility of maybe eventually using this pin. So here, it kind of gave me an idea. I see pawn pushing up and kind of creating a fork. But of course the knight right now is on the way. So this is why I played knight d to f5, because I'm also trying to stop rook f3 check. And here, as you can tell, there's two attackers, but I have 1, 2, 3 defenders. I'm also attacking his rook. So now his rook played f3, and now we go into the absolute pin. As you can tell, my knight is pinned, and this is an absolute pin because I absolutely cannot move the knight on f5. So I then continued with pawn to d4, taking advantage of the pin, and that was a relative pin. Pawn to g4, attacking my knight, so I decided, well, I can't move my knight, so I might as well take his knight. And here, as you can tell, he can immediately capture, but there's no need for him to immediately capture because he still has me pinned, so that's why he played b captures c3. I then decided, well, since you're attacking my knight, I'm going to attack your rook on f3. My opponent went to go ahead and accepted that trade and captured another pawn. And here I decided to play queen to d5. And the reason for queen to d5 is I'm also threatening a 2-move checkmate, which I'm hoping my opponent does not see. And I'm thinking my opponent maybe could have played queen to h4 and given up the bishop on d3 to stop me from getting checkmate. But instead, I think he wanted to save his bishop and then play queen to h4 to stop my queen and not lose his bishop. And by my opponent playing bishop to b1, I was then able to play